Let's talk about Kevin Sullivan, who, the news came out this morning that Kevin Sullivan had passed away at the age of 74. We had known that Kevin Sullivan had a serious medical issue earlier this year, which was not disclosed by the family, the specifics of which, but, he was fighting for his life. He was in ICU. He had developed a sepsis and had been battling several issues. So it had looked very bad at a certain point. And again, the family had kept this very quiet, but, being so much hospitalization, his medical bills were mounting, and they did have to launch a GoFundMe to support his medical bills. And you and I always talk about this way, but it's such a frequent, unfortunate reality. And, specific to those that are US based that might not have health insurance, or strictly their insurance will not cover such a lengthy stay in the hospital that you have to go the GoFundMe route. But it was unfortunate here in this situation as well. Like, you can imagine what that amount of time in the hospital, the bills that you're facing on top of fighting for your life, which he literally was.
I mean, I can't imagine sort of the emotional devastation that a family has to go through, on top of the stress that could last through a family, even beyond somebody's passing with medical bills. So I guess if any silver lining to take from something like this is that this was a time where you could really see the wrestling community come through. And with this GoFundMe, they did raise $54,000, which I think was well exceeding the initial goals. So yeah.
So just to go over some of the points about Kevin Sullivan's career, because he had a very lengthy one and held many different roles within the industry. And I'm going to imagine most people, especially of our generation, probably first came into contact with Kevin Sullivan, likely with WCW or even with ECW in the early 90s. And for some, I think that through YouTube and through tape trading and such, like some of his work in Florida it exists, but it's kind of scattered to those ones specifically. But he became a fan at a very young age, and then got into it, was a big fan of Bruno Sammartino, and then actually had his first match in Montreal, of all places. Was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is going to come to no surprise to anyone that ever heard this man's thick accent, which was as Boston as they come, and telling Dusty Rhodes, it's karma that's going to get you, Dusty Rhodes. And so he got kind of his first major territory was in Continental Wrestling. He wrestled as Johnny West for a period, and then was pretty much under his own name throughout the rest of his career. But man, worked in so many major territories. His first stop in Florida was in 1972, which he teamed with Mike Graham, the son of Eddie Graham, who was the owner of the territory. And that was 2 years before that territory exploded with Dusty Rhodes' babyface turn. And Sullivan was another one of those figures in Florida that was one of the disciples of Eddie Graham, where you had certain guys that came to that territory and they learned booking under Eddie Graham. Kevin Sullivan was one of them. Obviously, Dusty was one of them. Bill Watts was another. And that's another legacy of that territory, was the minds that came out of there and sort of learned under Eddie Graham, and then added their own sort of unique twist to, their booking style. Then went, among other places, he went to, his only time in the WWF was in the mid-70s, where he was there as an undercard babyface, worked several Madison Square Garden dates, but that was of his entire career. That was the time working in the WWF, and they did go out of their way tonight to got a video package on SmackDown tonight for him, and that certainly is a push that you have seen under this era of WWE, is that regardless of affiliation with the company, it's like they treat this as like, we are the overseers of the industry, and when a figure dies, we're going to, like, it's their responsibility to make sure that they have some representation on their television, on their website. And there were, a lot of tributes today that came from Paul Levesque and many people across the industry. And that wasn't always the case. When someone major died that didn't have those ties to WWE, it was always a crapshoot if there would even be a mention of someone passing away.
Sure. Yeah, and I think we can. I mean, we assumed at the time, but we can probably definitely deduce now that that was definitely more of a Vinceism. You know, whether or not he had a personal relationship with somebody, we always discuss. You know, who warrants a video package and who warrants just the graphic. I feel we've seen from this current regime that they are there to kind of recognize big names in the industry period, and certainly they have the video library to tell at least an effective video package story, and they did that tonight.
So then he goes through other territories, including Georgia Championship Wrestling, when it's on the Superstation. That's when he had his first major heel run, turning on Steve Kern. Then he went to Memphis, was back in Georgia, and it's in 1982 that he returns to Championship Wrestling from Florida. And this was the famous run where he becomes the Prince of Darkness. And this was, I would say, our closest comparison to like a Wyatt family type of stable. But this is in the early 80s, and it kind of just played off of like a lot of panic when it came to satanic rituals in society. And you're talking about, you know, a very heavy influence off of Charles Manson. And, you know, it was something that today, I think this holds up really well when you figure that this was happening in 1982, but it was certainly like a mixed bag at the time. This is after Florida has gone through its peak, and this is Kevin Sullivan having booking power in Florida and getting his, like, he was somebody that loved to build up heat, push things to the line, even go over the line. But the idea of building up your heels to such a degree that when the babyface conquers, it's a big, like, I think he would have loved the House of Torture. Maybe not in that exact presentation, but the idea of the House of Torture, that you get them to such a level that when you have the babyface conquer at the end, it's this big exhalation from your crowd that gets that. And we certainly saw this with the House of Darkness, but this was working with Mark Lewin as Purple Haze, Mike Davis as like the satanic version of Dusty Rhodes as the Dream, Bob Roop. They were able to corrupt an innocent reporter who would become Luna Vachon in the group, and of course Nancy Toffoloni, who would become Woman, who this was her first major role in professional wrestling. And of course, these two would end up together. Nancy would become Kevin's second wife, and they would be together up until they split in WCW. But after Florida, he goes to Jim Crockett Promotions, and that's when, you know, Florida was on its way on the descent, and many had followed Dusty when he left there to become Booker in Jim Crockett Promotions and its top babyface. And that's where Sullivan starts the Varsity Club in Jim Crockett Promotions. And after Turner had bought the company and George Scott was gone, that's when he became part of the WCW booking committee and would hold that role for quite some time, left WCW in the early 90s, and that's where he went to Japan. He went to ECW for a short time, working under Paul Heyman, and that's how Woman got into ECW. And then Sullivan ended up getting the head booker job at WCW when Eric Bischoff had taken over. Woman stayed in ECW, but several years later would go to WCW with him. And it's in that mid-90s period that I think that's where a lot of people were aware of Kevin Sullivan. And this is where he's the foil to Hulk Hogan. He is named Booker just 2 months after Hogan's debut, and he becomes the active performer that's also bringing in all the different monsters. And that's like, they had the Three Faces of Fear with Ed Leslie and Avalanche, and then that would eventually lead in 1995 to the infamous Dungeon of Doom. And I'm sure I would have hated this if we were reviewing this on a week-by-week basis, but man, do I love watching clips of Curtis Iakea. I mean, I will forever have like Sullivan in my ear whenever I hear Kevin Sullivan's name. I mean, this was just the wackiest group and some of the worst WCW programming, but it was kind of in line with where WCW was at the time. Like, look at this photo right here. These were Hulk Hogan's monsters to slay. And, Kevin Sullivan was in a role here. Like, he was booking, but this was certainly, you had Hogan to contend with. You had Eric Bischoff, kind of like his vision as the executive producer of this company. But right into the Nitro era, like, Kevin Sullivan's a major figure. He's in the midst of like the NWO construction, the rise of Bill Goldberg, who he had stated, he likened him like mirroring him after Mike Tyson, of someone with the black boots, the black tights, and comes in and just destroys guys. And he had that appeal to him as well. And Kevin Sullivan would stay in WCW right until the end. And there were times he was in power. There were times he was out of power. He had the program with Brian Pillman, which was a very well-known one. Of course, the program with Chris Benoit, where, that was always like the line that Kevin Sullivan manufactured his own divorce, because to get this angle over of woman leaving Kevin Sullivan on screen to be with Chris Benoit, and then life imitated art, and that's how things split there. And Kevin Sullivan was somebody who was always, it was very awkward. He would do a lot of shoot interviews, and invariably Benoit and Nancy would come up. And if you remember at that time when the murder-suicide happened, like, there were some erroneous speculation about people believing Kevin Sullivan, like conspiracy theories involving Kevin Sullivan that had no basis in fact. And he would have to like address these in interviews. And he was always so calm and just forthright in, like, he never was demeaning to either of them afterwards. But yeah, in WCW, like, he was, someone, you're seeing a lot of tributes today, but it's like he had his backers and he had his enemies in WCW. And the Radicals, like Kevin Sullivan being put back into booking power when they were sending Vince Russo home, Vince Russo would not join the writing committee, like Sullivan being in power, that was it for the Radicals. And they knew that their tenure in WCW would not be a positive one with Kevin Sullivan in control. And after a threat was issued by Mike Graham, that gave the Radicals the ability to get out of their contracts, because there could have been a lawsuit on their hands because of that threat that was uttered by Mike Graham. And that allowed those four, at the height of the wrestling war, to leave and walk on to Raw a week later, which is insane when you think about no compete clauses and all these protections. So this exact thing could not happen. And that's what happened with these four. And it was a big shift. And Sullivan being elevated, that was a big, that was their impetus for leaving in 2000. But Sullivan, he led the committee for just a few months before Russo and Bischoff come back. And then he kind of just stuck around till the end. He was someone that always thought that Turner never wanted WCW, that there was a drop dead date, and that this thing was not going to last. And there was, of course, the racial discrimination lawsuit, where he was someone that was deposed in that lawsuit and talked about things that he had witnessed. There was also a deposition with Randy Anderson as well, who, in his deposition thing, racist language he had heard Kevin Sullivan use. So like, there's that, which is a lawsuit not too many people, I think, know all the specifics about, but it really does paint a culture that was extremely toxic in WCW. But post WCW, like, he always was linked to pro wrestling in some form or fashion. Had a brief run in ROH in 2016, did lots of conventions, shoot interviews. He had the show on the MLW network, and someone that just you could hear, like, always loved speaking about wrestling, was a major baseball fan as well. And today, a lot of people were looking at the fact that this guy just seemed to be someone that was always willing to work with younger talent and share his ideas and such. But yeah, just somebody that, there's not too many people with that level of experience that goes back. Like, when you saw him in WCW, like, this guy was 25 years into his career by then, that started in 1970, and was still making appearances over these last couple of years as well. So 74 years of age. He had 4 children, and that was between 3 marriages over his life.